The moment the guns fell silent across the European battlefields, thousands of German soldiers found themselves no longer in command, no longer in control. They were no longer the hunters, but the hunted captured, disarmed, and shuffled into a strange new world. For many, the fear that had clung to them in the trenches and the burning villages of France, Belgium, and Germany did not vanish with surrender. It only shifted. Now their survival depended entirely on the mercy of the men who had once been their enemies, the Americans. For German prisoners of war, or POWs, the expectations were grim. They had been trained to believe that surrender was shameful, that captivity meant suffering, humiliation, and a slow erosion of dignity. The stories circulating through the ranks of harsh treatment, of near starvation, of constant abuse were enough to fill a man with dread. And yet, what awaited them on American soil was a reality that defied every assumption they had carried with them from the front lines. When the first columns of German soldiers were marched into makeshift camps in France and later across the Atlantic to the United States, a quiet shock swept through them. Instead of the brutality they had been conditioned to expect, they found order, cleanliness, and a strange, almost disarming respect for their basic human needs. It was a world far removed from the fire and mud of the battlefields, a place where the rules of war seemed strangely humane. At the heart of this transformation was the American military ethos, rooted in principles that were, at times, almost alien to the German soldiers. The Geneva Conventions, treaties that Germany itself had ratified but often ignored, were upheld rigorously in the U.S. camps. Food, medical care, and shelter were provided consistently, and in many cases these were luxuries the men had not seen in years of combat. Where German soldiers had endured starvation rations, diseases, and relentless punishment for minor mistakes, the Americans offered regular meals, clean bedding, and the occasional comfort of letters from home. The arrival in America was itself an ordeal wrapped in irony. Transported by ships that were secure and well-maintained, German POWs crossed the Atlantic, under the watch of men who, mere weeks before, they had seen as mortal enemies. The journey was long, tense, and fraught with uncertainty, but it was nothing like the nightmares of overcrowded transport trains they had survived in Europe. Here, on these vessels, they were treated with a decency that began to unsettle their expectations. No one shouted at them. No one beat them for misbehavior. Instead, they were given basic hygiene facilities, allowed to move freely within designated areas, and even offered newspapers to read written in German, no less. It was during this passage that the first seeds of disbelief took root. Many of these soldiers, hardened by years of propaganda and discipline, began to question everything they had been taught. Could it be true that the enemy they had been trained to despise could behave with such dignity? Could men who had fought them so fiercely now be capable of compassion and respect? For some, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, almost unbearable. Upon arrival in the United States, the camps themselves became arenas of quiet revelation. Camps were often located in rural areas, far from the chaos of American cities, designed to house thousands of prisoners in secure, self-contained communities. Yet despite the scale, the organization was meticulous. POWs were assigned barracks with bunk beds, blankets, and personal space that, in many cases, surpassed the living conditions of American soldiers themselves. The grounds were kept clean, latrines were sanitized, and medical facilities were staffed and ready to treat sickness or injury. Perhaps most shocking to the German soldiers was the food. Meals were provided regularly, and while they were not extravagant, they were nutritious, plentiful, and served in an orderly fashion. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and milk were standard fare. For soldiers accustomed to hunger and malnourishment on the front lines, each meal became a quiet marvel, a small yet persistent reminder that their captors had chosen humanity over cruelty. Many men could scarcely believe their luck. Some even joked, in disbelief, that they were living better than they had during their service in the Wehrmacht. The Americans went beyond mere sustenance. POWs were offered opportunities for work, recreation, and even education. Those who wanted to keep busy could be employed within the camps, maintaining the grounds, helping with cooking, or performing clerical tasks. Work was paid in small allowances, enough to buy cigarettes, small luxuries, or personal items from the camp store. There were libraries, musical instruments, and athletic facilities. Soccer games, theater productions, and even lectures were organized, creating a semblance of normalcy that seemed almost surreal to men who had known only the constant pressure of survival. Perhaps the most profound shock came from the behavior of the American guards themselves. These were young men, often no older than the POWs they supervised, who had themselves faced the chaos of battle. Yet they treated the prisoners not as enemies to be humiliated, but as human beings to be managed with fairness and respect. Discipline existed, certainly, but it was applied predictably and without malice. Offenses were met with warnings or proportionate consequences, never cruelty. In countless letters and memoirs written years later, former German POW recalled the bewildering sense of decency they encountered daily. The cultural gap was striking. These men had been raised in a rigidly hierarchical society where obedience was demanded and dissent punished. They had fought in an army where failure could mean death or disgrace, and where civilians had been subjected to harsh, arbitrary controls. Now, in these American camps, they found themselves treated with a kind of trust and autonomy that challenged everything they had internalized. God spoke to them politely, often encouraged them to express themselves, and allowed them moments of personal choice in an otherwise structured environment. It was not all idyllic. Conflicts arose, frustrations simmered, and the psychological tension of captivity never fully disappeared. Some men clung stubbornly to their expectations of harsh treatment, testing boundaries, or resisting authority. Others suffered from guilt, shame, or the lingering trauma of war. Yet, even in moments of tension, the fundamental humanity of the American approach remained. The system was designed not to break men, but to contain and protect them. A subtle but profound difference from the brutality many had anticipated. Letters home, smuggled or allowed through the censor, painted pictures of life that many German families could scarcely comprehend. Fathers, brothers, and sons who had feared for their lives found themselves able to reassure loved ones that, contrary to the stories of horror from the front, they were alive, safe, and even if only slightly well-fed and cared for. The shock was mutual. Families often could not believe that the enemy, the American, had treated their loved ones better than their own army ever had. Psychologists and historians note that this treatment had profound long-term effects. Men who survived the war in humane conditions were more likely to return to society without carrying the intense bitterness that might have festered under harsher regimes. The unexpected kindness fostered a grudging respect, even admiration, for the American, planting seeds of reconciliation long before the war formally ended. For many, this was their first experience of a world in which strength was measured not solely in violence but in civility and competence. The contrast could not have been starker. On the Eastern Front, soldiers had witnessed unspeakable atrocities and lived under constant fear of brutal punishment. Even on the Western Front, the German army often imposed harsh discipline on its own men, valuing obedience above well-being. And now, across thousands of miles, these same soldiers were encountering an entirely different paradigm, one in which their captors sought to maintain order without eroding dignity, to enforce rules without inflicting unnecessary pain. As weeks turned into months, many POWs began to adapt. Daily routines became familiar, and initial disbelief gave way to cautious acceptance. Men learned to navigate the rules of the camps, to form friendships, and even to discover skills or interests that had lain dormant amidst the chaos of war. Letters continued to flow, packages from families arrived, and some even found themselves reflecting on the absurdity of their prior expectations. The enemy, it seemed, could be fair, even compassionate, a revelation that many struggled to fully comprehend. In quiet moments, the POWs would talk among themselves, often with a mix of humor and disbelief. Stories circulated of men marveling at the efficiency of American kitchens, or the friendliness of a guard who had once been an anonymous figure in a uniform. These were not tales of defeat or humiliation, but of surprise, sometimes tinged with reluctant admiration. The soldiers who had expected brutality found themselves in an environment where their most basic needs were met with consistency, care, and, in many ways, respect. And yet, beneath the surface of this unexpected kindness, questions lingered. Why were they treated so differently here? Could it be genuine, or was it a clever strategy, a way to pacify and control them? Some wondered if this civility was simply another layer of psychological warfare, designed to disarm not just their bodies but their minds. Over time, however, the consistency of the treatment, the transparency of the rules, and the absence of hidden cruelty made such doubts fade. This was not deception, it was a different philosophy of war entirely. By the time the first German POWs returned home after the war, many carried stories that would astonish their friends and families. Tales of clean barracks, regular meals, and courteous guards seemed almost unbelievable to those who had lived through the horrors of combat. Yet, these accounts were not embellishments. They were the lived experiences of men who had expected the worst and discovered something profoundly different, that even in war, humanity could endure, and even enemies could show compassion that outshone the cruelty of their own comrades. The shock, the disbelief, and the quiet gratitude these men felt would resonate for the rest of their lives. They had crossed an ocean to a foreign land, surrendered under duress, and found themselves treated with dignity beyond anything they had imagined possible. In the annals of World War II, this stands as one of the more quietly astonishing stories, proof that even amid the chaos and brutality of global conflict, decency could persist, transforming lives in ways that mere survival never could. And as they settled into this new, disarming reality, the German POW began to understand a profound truth, that war was not only fought with weapons, but with choices about how to treat the defeated, how to preserve humanity even in the darkest of times. In the camps scattered across the United States, thousands of men learned, sometimes for the first time in their lives, that mercy and respect were not signs of weakness, but of strength. It was a lesson they would carry home, a lesson that would challenge their assumptions, reshape their memories, and linger long after the guns had fallen silent for the final time. For in the hearts and minds of these men, the realization was clear they had never imagined, that the Americans, the enemy, could treat them better than their own army ever had. And in that revelation lay a story that deserved to be told. Life in the American camps was a strange, almost surreal experience for the German soldiers. Days stretched long, measured not by the rush of combat or the crackle of artillery, but by routine, the rising sun, the roll call, the clatter of mess hall trays, the rhythms of work assignments, and the quiet hours in the barracks. For many, the monotony was unsettling, a stark contrast to the constant danger and adrenaline of battle. Yet, beneath the surface of this predictability, a world of unexpected opportunity, curiosity, and personal transformation began to emerge. One of the most surprising aspects of camp life was the sense of autonomy granted to the POWs. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the German army, where every action was monitored and every mistake punished, American camps allowed prisoners a degree of freedom they had never known. They could organize themselves, form committees, hold meetings, even establish small councils to address issues within the camp. These councils were not just symbolic, they had real influence over daily life, from work assignments to recreational activities. For men accustomed to following orders without question, this newfound responsibility was both empowering and bewildering. Work within the camps offered another layer of unexpected experience. POWs were employed in a variety of roles. Some worked on farms, helping to alleviate labor shortages caused by the war. Others helped maintain the camp infrastructure, cooking, cleaning, or repairing buildings. A few even assisted with administrative tasks, translating documents or keeping records. The work was not forced labor in the brutal sense. They were paid a small wage for their efforts. The money could be spent on personal items, tobacco, or special treats from the camp store. For men who had survived the front lines on barely enough food to survive, this autonomy and modest compensation were almost alien. Education was another remarkable feature of life in the camps. German POWs were offered the chance to learn English, study mathematics, or engage in a wide variety of cultural and vocational courses. Libraries were established, stocked with German language books as well as English texts, and men were encouraged to read and expand their knowledge. Some took these opportunities seriously, mastering new skills or preparing for life after the war. Others approached it with curiosity, immersing themselves in literature or exploring subjects they had never had access to before. In a sense, the camps became a strange classroom of the world outside the war, exposing men to ideas, knowledge, and possibilities far removed from the battlefield. The recreational opportunities further deepened the surreal sense of normalcy. Sports, theater, and musical activities flourished within the camps. Soccer matches became popular, with teams formed between barracks and competitions organized that mirrored the sports leagues back home. Theater productions were staged, often written and performed by the prisoners themselves. Some men played instruments, forming bands or orchestras, filling the air with music that felt both foreign and comforting. These activities were more than mere distractions. They provided a vital psychological outlet, a way for men to regain a sense of identity, creativity, and purpose. Among the POWs, there was a mixture of reactions to this new reality. Some remained deeply skeptical, convinced that the Americans were lulling them into complacency. that kindness was a strategy to disarm them psychologically. Others embraced the opportunities, forging friendships, and discovering aspects of themselves long buried by the hardships of war. Humor became a powerful tool for survival. Countless stories tell of men laughing at the absurdity of their situation, marveling at the contradiction between their training to fear the enemy and the reality of their treatment. Perhaps the most striking accounts come from letters, diaries, and interviews conducted after the war. German POWs often described a profound disbelief at the generosity they encountered. Meals were plentiful, hygiene standards were high, and the medical care was thorough and attentive. Unlike the German army, where malnutrition and disease were constant threats in America, camps' illness was treated promptly, and men rarely went without necessary care. This created an environment of stability and safety, a rare sanctuary after years of constant threat. One story that became widely known among former POWs was that of a man who had been wounded in combat and feared the lack of medical attention during captivity. Upon arrival at an American camp, he was treated by attentive doctors and nurses who ensured his recovery was complete. For the first time in years, he felt secure, cared for, and, remarkably, respected as a human being rather than a soldier, a number, or a potential threat. These experiences were repeated across countless camps, forming a pattern of humane treatment that was unprecedented in modern warfare. Life in the camps also fostered a unique cross-cultural exchange. Many POWs interacted closely with local American communities, particularly in rural areas where labor shortages meant that prisoners were employed on farms. These interactions, often tentative at first, led to surprising connections. German soldiers met families, attended local events under supervision, and occasionally shared meals or conversation with civilians. While there were tensions and misunderstandings, there were also moments of genuine friendship and cultural curiosity. Men who had been trained to see Americans as invincible, threatening enemies now encountered ordinary people who were kind, curious, and respectful. Cultural adaptation was not always smooth. Language barriers, different customs, and the lingering stigma of being an enemy soldier created friction. Some POWs struggled with boredom, depression, or homesickness, and incidents of rebellion or conflict did occur. Yet, the system was designed to channel these tensions constructively. Psychological support was implicit in the structure. Activities, education, work, and recreation all helped maintain morale and prevent unrest. For historians examining these camps today, the success of this approach is remarkable. Despite housing tens of thousands of enemy combatants, the incidence of major disturbances was remarkably low. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these camps was the subtle transformation that occurred over time. Men who arrived filled with distrust and fear gradually came to accept, and in some cases admire, the system around them. They learned new skills, formed friendships, and began to see their captors not merely as enemies, but as human beings with their own virtues and weaknesses. Stories abound of men leaving the camps with a newfound respect for American organization, fairness, and ingenuity. In letters home, they often remarked that they had never imagined life could be so orderly, safe, and, at times, even pleasant, despite the reality of being prisoners of war. The camps also revealed a deep contrast between the German POWs' experience in the US and their expectations of captivity in German hands. Many had been trained to believe that surrender was dishonorable, that those who were captured would be treated brutally, that kindness was a weakness to be exploited. Their time in American camps shattered these assumptions. The reality was so stark that men often commented that they were treated better than they had been by their own officers or the German military bureaucracy. This dissonance created an internal struggle, forcing POWs to reconcile their ingrained beliefs with the reality they were experiencing. Humor and small rebellions became a coping mechanism. Men would prank each other, stage small theatrical performances, or engage in spirited competitions. These acts of levity were essential for mental health, breaking the monotony and providing moments of joy. At the same time, they demonstrated a quiet resilience, a refusal to be reduced to mere numbers or objects in a bureaucratic machine. In a strange way, these behaviors strengthened the bonds between the prisoners, fostering a sense of community that endured even beyond the war. Religious and spiritual life also played a role in the camps. POWs were often allowed to practice their faith freely, and chaplains from both Protestant and Catholic backgrounds ministered to them. Services were held, and religious study groups formed, giving men a sense of moral and emotional support. For those grappling with guilt, fear, or trauma, this access to spiritual guidance was invaluable. It underscored a central theme of American POW policy. Even in captivity, the prisoner's humanity mattered. It was not just individual experiences that were striking entire community of POWs began to thrive in these constrained circumstances. Barracks became lively centers of intellectual debate, sports competitions, music, and theatrical expression. Men shared their experiences, stories of the front lines, and dreams for the future. They learned from each other, debated politics, and in some cases, developed the skills and confidence to imagine a life after the war that did not rely on military discipline or obedience. The camps, unintentionally, became schools of personal growth and resilience. Despite the positive conditions, the shadow of war was never far away. News from Europe filtered in, bringing updates of battles, losses, and victories. POWs worried about families, about friends who had not survived, and about the uncertain future of a continent still engulfed in conflict. These worries reminded them that, no matter how humane their immediate surroundings, they remained prisoners far from home, and at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The contrast between the violence outside and the order within the camp was never lost on them. It only deepened their appreciation for the care and dignity they were afforded. By the time the war neared its end, many German POWs had undergone a subtle transformation. The initial shock, disbelief, and suspicion gave way to a recognition that their captors had chosen a different path, one that combined discipline with humanity, security with respect. Letters sent home reflected this realization. Men described orderly camps, nutritious meals, fair treatment, and opportunities for work and education. Families back in Germany were often astonished, unable to reconcile these reports with the harsh realities of life under German command. Perhaps most importantly, the experience sowed seeds of reconciliation. Former soldiers who had once been taught to despise Americans began to view them as people, not just enemies. The respect and decency they experienced created a lingering impression, one that would shape attitudes long after the war. In many cases, POWs returned home with stories not of cruelty, but of surprising humanity, a reminder that, even in the darkest chapters of human history, small acts of decency can have a profound, lasting impact. As the war drew to a close, the German POWs who had spent months, even years, in American camps faced a strange and unsettling uncertainty. For much of their captivity, the routine of camp life had been both a comfort and a puzzle. They had adapted, learned, and even thrived in ways they could scarcely have imagined. Yet now, the question loomed, what would life look like when the world outside these fences collided with the truths they had discovered behind them? The process of repatriation was slow, deliberate, and fraught with emotion. Men who had survived the battlefields only to find safety, food, and dignity in enemy hands were now being sent back to a homeland that was fractured, defeated, and struggling to rebuild. Many feared that the lessons learned, the quiet dignity they had come to expect, would vanish in the chaos of post-war Germany. Yet, even as they prepared to leave, the memories of humane treatment, of small freedoms and unexpected kindnesses, left an indelible mark. The journey home itself was a mirror of their initial arrival, a crossing filled with tension, anticipation, and reflection. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic, each man carrying stories that seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. They spoke in quiet voices of the food they had eaten, the libraries they had read in, the friendships they had formed, and the surprising respect shown to them by young American soldiers who not long ago had been enemies. The contrast was stark. This was not the revenge or humiliation they had been conditioned to expect. This was decency, consistent and persistent. Upon returning to Germany, the reality was harsh. Cities lay in ruins, families were displaced, and the economy was shattered. Some POWs struggled to reconcile their experiences in American camps with the desolation that greeted them at home. Yet for many, the lessons learned overseas provided a sense of perspective, a mental and emotional anchor amidst the chaos. They had witnessed an alternative way of conducting human affairs, even in war, a way that valued dignity, fairness, and compassion. And in that knowledge lay hope that the world could operate differently, even in the aftermath of destruction. Historians and psychologists who have studied these POW experiences note the profound effect this period had on those who survived it. Men who had been hardened by ideology and battle found themselves reconsidering long-held beliefs about humanity, authority, and morality. They had been taught to expect cruelty from those in power, to equate strength with brutality, and to view compassion as a weakness. In the quiet, controlled environment of the American camps, those assumptions were repeatedly challenged and often overturned. For many, this was the first time they encountered an alternative model of authority, one in which order did not rely on fear, and respect was earned, not forced. Among the most striking accounts are those of POWs who described the emotional complexity of their captor relationships. Guards who had once been faceless adversaries became human in ways that surprised them. Some guards offered advice, mentorship, or even small acts of kindness, like helping a man write a letter home or lending a book. Others simply listened when prisoners spoke, acknowledging their humanity without judgment. For men conditioned to expect only hatred from the enemy, this empathy was transformative. It was not pity. They were not treated as less than human, but a recognition that their lives mattered, even in captivity. Perhaps nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the stories of POWs who had formed personal connections with local American communities, on farms, in small towns, and in rural neighborhoods. Some prisoners had developed relationships that went beyond mere labor. They were greeted with cautious friendliness, offered help, or even invited to participate in community events under supervision. These experiences planted seeds of mutual understanding and respect, long before formal reconciliation between nations could take place. The psychological impact of these humane interactions cannot be overstated. For men who had seen death and destruction at close range, who had endured hunger, fear, and relentless pressure, the experience of being treated with fairness, decency, and compassion was astonishing. It challenged their beliefs, reshaped their memories of what war could be like, and altered their understanding of the enemy. Many POWs later admitted that the Americans had not just preserved their physical life. They had preserved their dignity and, in some cases, their faith in human decency. But the story does not end with mere survival or comfort. There were moments of tension, confrontation, and of profound moral reflection. Some POWs struggled with guilt for being captured, guilt for surviving when so many had not, guilt for witnessing, a kind of humanity in the enemy that contrasted sharply with the horrors they had seen committed by their own forces. These moral and emotional complexities gave their experiences a depth that simple narratives of captivity or liberation could never capture. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this came in the accounts of soldiers who, after months in the camps, were asked to participate in labor projects that directly supported American communities. Fields needed harvesting, infrastructure needed repair, and POWs were invited, not coerced, to contribute. Many approached this work with hesitation, unsure if they were being tested or manipulated. Yet, in the act of cooperation, a subtle but powerful transformation occurred. Men who had once seen Americans solely as enemies began to see them as partners in a shared, human endeavor, even if temporary and constrained. The lessons learned in these moments would linger far longer than the war itself. As repatriation continued, stories of the POW experience began to spread. Soldiers wrote letters, kept diaries, and recounted their experiences to friends and family. The astonishment was universal. Those at home could not believe that the enemy had treated their sons, brothers, and husbands with such consistent decency. Reports of clean barracks, regular meals, fair treatment, and opportunities for recreation and education were met with disbelief. Yet these stories were true, and they painted a picture of war that was rarely told, a story of humanity prevailing amid the machinery of conflict. Over the years, many former POWs reflected on the paradox of their experience. They had been trained to expect cruelty from every corner of the world, yet they found themselves treated better than they had ever been treated by their own army. They had anticipated humiliation and hardship, but instead discovered dignity, fairness, and compassion. These revelations were transformative, shaping their post-war lives, their attitude toward the United States, and their understanding of what it meant to be human. The story of German POWs in America is not simply one of survival. It is a story of unexpected grace. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about enemies, conflict, and morality. In a world defined by destruction, the Americans demonstrated that strength and compassion need not be mutually exclusive. They showed that even amid global conflict, respect for human dignity could endure, leaving a legacy that resonated long after the guns had fallen silent. And as historians, veterans, and descendants look back on these camps, they see a lesson that transcends the war itself. These men were prisoners, yes, but they were also witnesses to a profound human truth, that the choice we make in moments of power and authority define us, often more than the battles we fight. In the care, fairness, and occasional kindness extended to these soldiers, the world saw a vision of what war could be if humanity were never abandoned entirely. For the German POWs who survived this experience, the impact was lifelong. Many carried these memories with them, telling their children and grandchildren of a time when the enemy treated them with more decency than their own leaders had. They spoke of clean barracks, nourishing food, books that opened their mind, and the simple yet revolutionary act of being listened to and respected. In these moments, the war's most profound victories were not measured in territory or weaponry, but in the preservation of dignity, the restoration of hope, and the quiet affirmation of human decency. The American camps were more than holding facilities, they were arenas of moral triumph, unlike classrooms where men learned, often for the first time, that even enemies can behave with honor. And in that, there lies a story that deserves to be remembered, a story that echoes through the decades, that even in the darkest hours of human history, acts of kindness and respect have the power to transform lives, challenge assumptions, and restore faith in humanity. As the last trains carried prisoners back to Germany, as the final ships crossed the Atlantic with their human cargo, the impact of these camps became clear. Men returned to a broken country, yet with hearts and minds reshaped by their experiences. They had survived not only the war, but also the extraordinary revelation that decency could exist amid destruction, that even enemies could share humanity, and that the enemy who treated them better than their own army had, in a sense, rewritten the rules of what it meant to survive. And so, the story of the German POWs in America remains, decades later, one of the most remarkable paradoxes of World War II. Captured and displaced, they found that survival alone was not the ultimate gift. They found that the recognition of their humanity, their dignity, and their worth was something far more profound. In the echoes of these camps, in the memories of men who had crossed oceans as captives, we see the enduring truth that even in war, the measure of a nation is not only in its victories, but in its capacity for compassion. In the end, the German POWs left with more than freedom. They carried with them the realization that decency can survive in the darkest times, that respect and humanity are weapons of their own, and that the Americans, the enemy they had never imagined could be merciful, had set a standard that would resonate long after the last gun had fallen silent. It is a story of paradox, of shock, of transformation, and ultimately, of hope.